Ricky said, I have been intrigued with the idea of the potential of motivational interviewing for our work, particularly for helping us build relationships in what's often a very short time frame, and to have the kinds of communication skills that we need to be effective. I'm going to let Dave tell more about himself because I know he's going to do that, but I think we're in for a treat. So thanks so much, Dave.
Thank you, Madeline. Well, welcome to everyone tonight. It's a pleasure to have all of you with us on board tonight for a little discussion about motivational interviewing. And some of you may have run into this if you're in the helping professions, but I'm assuming that most of you, this will be brand new. And tonight's presentation, therefore, will take a very introductory approach to motivational interviewing. And I'll give you resources toward the end if you'd like to go into greater depth to learn more about it. So our topic is motivational interviewing, specifically for citizen advocates, specifically for those of us who are actively engaged in lobbying, specifically Citizens Climate Lobby. Motivational interviewing is a communication style, and its primary objective is to foster collaboration between the parties involved. Here's just a few of our learning objectives for this evening. I would like to help you learn the 4 basic MI skill sets. I'd like to give you a chance to practice some of the MI skills to partner for change in your lobbying work. And I'd also like to use a learning team that will expand your skills. So when we do our breakout sessions, the system will automatically break you into units of 3 and little breakout rooms. And I'll give you some specific instructions for the sorts of things that I'd like you to practice there. So just a little bit more background on motivational interviewing. I am a clinical psychologist in private practice, but I also do trainings in motivational interviewing for a broad range of professionals. And these are some of the ones that you see on screen that I teach motivational interviewing to. Motivational interviewing has been found to be a very effective a set of communication tools and skills for people who have to collaborate with other people. If we look at the one here in the top left corner, when I work with physicians and nurses, they share much in common with us as lobbyists. Current statistics indicate that the average physician in the United States spends about 13.5 minutes on average per patient. We have not much more time than that frequently with the people that we're lobbying. So motivational interviewing has been shown to increase effectiveness even in very brief interactions with patients or other people. So we'll show you how that can be a benefit to you in your lobbying work. A little bit more background for me. I got my PhD from Utah State University in professional and scientific psychology. I was a research psychologist and academic psychologist for 6 years, from 1992 to 98 at University of Idaho, and have been a clinical psychologist in practice since that time. And this is a picture of my current practice, which I maintain out of my home office. So we're talking about collaboration skills, and MI is all about fostering your ability to collaborate with other people. These skills, of course, are central to lobbying. I'm actually in this picture. You can see me there at the very top row. If you see that little glare, that's the top of my bald head shining in the morning sun on the Capitol. So let's take a minute, and I'd like to share with you how I have found MI skills useful personally. And to do this, I'm going to tell you a little story about how I got into activism in the first place. This is my hometown, St. George, Utah, southwest corner of the state, out in the Red Rock country that some of you probably associate with Utah. It was a great place to grow up. If you see the little white oval in the lower left corner, that is the circle around the school that I went to as a child in St. George. Unfortunately, this bucolic little community had a dirty secret lurking just over the horizon you're looking at. 90 miles over that horizon, the Atomic Energy Commission was detonating nuclear devices and at the Nevada testing site. And unfortunately, my town was the first town directly downwind from that site. From 1951 to 1963, the Atomic Energy Commission detonated 126 nuclear bombs directly upwind from my community. You can see a few of the craters that were left behind. There's that school that I circled earlier. My mother went to this school. And she says, with each explosion, the front doors of the high school banged open and closed. Then a few hours later, the dirty cloud would roll over us. This bomb went off when I was 3 years old. It was the Storax sedan explosion. I was in my sandbox, most likely, when this thing went off. It left a 1,000-foot or a 1,200-foot wide crater, which you can still visit today. The hazmat gear is optional at this point. The site has cooled down to where there's little background radiation. That wasn't the case when the bomb went off. We first noticed that sheep were dying out in the desert between us and the test site, and then people in our community started developing very strange cancers that we'd never seen before and in very high numbers. To give you one example, this is my neighbor, Elmer Pickett, lives 1 block from where I grew up. I went to school with his son. Elmer Pickett lost 10 members of his family to radiation-induced leukemia. We formed an organization. Not unlike CCL, we were concerned citizens, and we decided to take action. We had 3 goals. We wanted to stop the testing, get the government to acknowledge the effects, and compensate victims that were mounting. The first step, as we know at CCL, is to have data, and data has been critical to our efforts at CCL. As downwinders, we collected data. I was part of a contingent of individuals who went out and collected the epidemiological data to show, and we found conclusively, that there was a direct correlation between exposure to the radiation and the incidence of cancer-related or radiation-related cancers. But as we know at CCL, data is necessary, but sadly not sufficient to persuade people in many cases. So we found that the thing that really we had to do was to collaborate. And I'd like you to think about the kinds of collaboration that are required at CCL, because they're very parallel to the kinds we found as downwinders. There's 2 kinds of collaboration. There's collaboration within our organization and collaboration between us and the policymakers, the members of Congress, that have to make the laws that we're seeking to implement. So as downwinders, we found we had to collaborate at a local level with citizens, our local college, city government, religious groups. This is the grassroots level. At the state level, we collaborated with our governor, with epidemiological scientists, state representatives, agencies, institutions, and various media. But of course, the collaboration that makes the most difference, and this is true for CCL, is the national level, where we have members of Congress who can vote on legislation. And we had Ted Kennedy on our side. We had a number of other key individuals that we were able to collaborate with. As a result, after 30 years of efforts, collaboration worked. And in 1990, Congress passed RECA, the Radiation Exposure and Compensation Act, which has thus far provided $1.8 billion in compensation to victims. And many of my family members have received compensation, that is, the ones that have survived. So collaboration is critical. It takes more than data. And tonight we're going to be talking about tools that can really facilitate your collaborative work in lobbying. I'd like to ask you, who must you collaborate with to further your work? These are some of the people I have to collaborate with. So within my organization, on the top left is Jack Green. He's very easy to collaborate with. He's been a longtime leader of our local CCL group. But you may need to collaborate with people within your organization that are not always easy to collaborate with. The tools that we're presenting tonight work not only within your organization, but between you and outside individuals. The next picture at the top right is Representative Ed Redd, state representative. CCL has had meetings with him here in my home that I'm sitting in now. He's not too hard to deal with. You can see that he's environmentally minded. He campaigns on a bicycle. He's environmentally conscious. The next fellow you see at the bottom, though, is a little tougher to deal with. And this is my member of Congress from my district, Representative Rob Bishop, who sadly is a little tougher to work with when it comes to environmental issues. And I'll give you some examples of my work with him as it relates to motivational interviewing. What I'd like you to do now is think about a person you'd like to partner with, so that as we go over these principles tonight, you will have someone in mind specifically that you would like to apply these principles with. It could be somebody in your immediate CCL group that you feel a need to collaborate more effectively with, or it may be your member of Congress or some other significant individual that's key to us moving carbon fee and dividend forward. Take a moment now, if you've got a pencil handy, and jot that person's name down. And notice that we call these individuals partners, because in motivational interviewing, we don't see the person across from us as an advocate, an enemy, an obstacle. It's important psychologically to see that individual as a partner with whom you're going to partner towards common goals. You may be asking, wait a minute, how do I collaborate with people who may not want to collaborate with me? And of course, that's exactly what MI is for. Let's take a look. But before we do, let's point out some of the common mistakes that we as lobbyists make. We sometimes call these the dirty dozen. It's very easy to resort to scaring, persuading, warning, reasoning, arguing, demanding, blaming, lecturing, disapproving, debating, guilt-tripping when all else fails. And I don't know how well those work for you, but they've never worked very well for me. And so we have to recognize these methods come very naturally when we get frustrated, but they have a very poor track record. These direct persuasion methods, unfortunately, tend to create direct resistance. People respond back in kind. Let's take a quick example. It's very easy to use fear-based messages to promote our agenda. It's easy to provide solid data of melting polar ice caps or rising sea levels, and in fact, this may create fear. But the research on this, as a behavioral scientist, I'm always interested in the behavioral research. The science shows us that fear-based messages generally have either no effect or actually a counterproductive effect in prompting people to avoid the messenger. And so we have to be very careful with fear-based messages. There are a few exceptions to this. We won't go into them here, but we want to give you some tools that are much more reliable. So what does work? Motivational interviewing works. And we now have over 1,200 refereed journal publications looking at motivational interviewing applied with a variety of populations and under a variety of circumstances. And it's been around since 1983. This is Bill Miller, the person who first developed motivational interviewing and the author of the primary book that describes it. The third edition is now out. By the way, I assume that we have the option for questions, or do we, Ricky? Do folks have a chance to answer questions or ask questions at this point?
Yeah, absolutely. So we can stop whenever you feel like taking a break to ask questions. There's a couple ways that people could participate. Again, they could unmute themselves if they're on the phone by pressing *6, or unmute themselves online by clicking the microphone symbol. Or if someone doesn't want to ask the question live, they can type their question in the chat window as well, and we can read the question out and give you a chance.
Dave?
Yes.
This is Dave in San Francisco. Can you hear me?
Yes, coming through.
Well, listen, this sounds like a great introduction. I just can't help asking, were you affected by the radiation?
Not to my knowledge. Sadly, some of these cancers develop very slowly over the lifespan, but I am pretty sure that I'm out of that window now, so I'm feeling pretty good about it. Sadly, other folks have not been so lucky. We know that some people have higher susceptibilities to radiation-induced problems, but so far so good in my case, but thank you.
That's good to hear.
Any other questions? Sounds good. Well, don't hesitate to interrupt if you have a burning question, but we will be stopping periodically to take questions. So, motivational interviewing is based on the idea that people change best when that change serves their values. And that's a very subtle but important difference. It's easy for us to go in presenting our values, and motivational interviewing makes it incumbent upon us to learn the values of the person that we're working with so that we tailor our approach directly to their values. And we'll show you how to do that. Here are the 4 skill sets that we're going to be covering this evening. First of all, the spirit of MI. We'll go into briefly touch on these concepts, the 4 processes, 3 core skills, or the third section is on the core skills. The acronym for that is OARS. And then finally, we're going to talk about how we evoke change talk. And our acronym for that is DARNCAT. You'll get used to the goofy acronyms, I assure you. So we're ready for our first breakout room. And what I'd like you to do is take about 5 minutes And in this breakout room, I'd like you to introduce yourself to your other two partners that you'll find eagerly awaiting you there. And I'd like you to describe the person that you're going to be working with tonight. That is the target person. The person, this might be your member of Congress, it might be a fellow CCL individual. It's the person that you would like to practice your MI skills in collaboration with. And also talk just a little bit about your goal. Any questions that you had about who to use as your partner or how to set a reasonable goal? Any questions about that?
This is Danielle, and I was just wondering, since you mentioned, could you give us an example of an appropriate goal?
Yes, and we mentioned this in the little group that I broke into. A good goal is one that's realistic. So for example, the people that we work with, MI, we won't go into the details of this tonight, but MI categorizes the partners you're working with into 5 categories. Pre-contemplation, that is people who aren't even contemplating collaborating with your agenda. Contemplators are the folks that say, well, maybe I could see myself collaborating. Next comes preparation. This is where they're actually taking actions to prepare to collaborate with you, collecting information and such. Action is where they're literally collaborating, they're on board fully. And maintenance is where they've now been collaborating with you consistently for 6 months. That's how we look at it from a research standpoint. So your goal probably should take their stage of change into account. In other words, if my congressperson, Rob Bishop, is definitely a pre-contemplator, that's the earliest phase, so my goals with him are fairly modest. Keep him engaged. We want to keep a positive relationship. We want to keep him friendly towards us and asking for information and moving him forward in those stages of change. That's the goal that I have for him. So let's talk about that first skill set. This is what we call the spirit of motivational interviewing, and our acronym for this is PACE, which stands for Partnership, Acceptance, Compassion, and Evocation. Here's what we mean by that. We want a partnership of equals. And this is really requires that we recognize when we're lobbying with someone, we're in a partnership that is codependent, positively dependent in 2 directions. I once visited an Air Force base and they were showing me the cockpits of the jet fighters. And if you look just below this cockpit, you'll see a blue arrow that points to a little triangle. And I've blown that triangle up so that you can see what it says. It says danger, ejection seat. And we have to remember that we're always in that ejection seat. The other party can hit the eject button at any time. And so we really want to show that we're approaching this as a partnership of equals. Acceptance means that we recognize the absolute worth of the other party. We have accurate empathy. We really want to understand them accurately. We respect their autonomy, and we are going to be affirming them, which is already a part of the CCL approach. And we'll talk about how MI does that. So there's some attitudes that definitely interfere with this kind of acceptance, and they create something that scientists refer to as emotional leakage. Emotional leakage is something that we're all familiar with. It's that time when somebody's emotional reactions are telling us what they really think in spite of what their voice is telling us. It's very easy when we're dealing with tough partners to believe that they're in denial, ignorant, deluded, uncaring, maybe evil or immoral or stupid or backward. The problem is these attitudes create emotional leakage, and our partner will pick up on that in most cases. They smell it, and you can smell it when somebody has those attitudes about you. And so in a joking way, we sometimes talk about it being useful to visit the hokey pokey clinic. Now, this is just my name for it. Most of you remember the hokey pokey, which was a little thing we did as kids, and one of the lines in it is, it's about turning yourself around. And that's sometimes exactly what we have to do before we do our lobbying work. There's some ways to do this. We really need to develop compassion for our partner. And compassion can be developed by news articles, reading those about our partner, visiting their website, looking at the lobby notes we've taken previously and interactions with them, and of course chatting with our fellow CCL members who may have worked with this person. That's where we get the data to really show the level of compassion and understanding that we want to. Let's take an example here. Many of you have a hard time engaging with Republicans. This woman obviously is not one of those individuals. That was a joke, of course. Here are some specific Republican values that I've collected over time, and if you're working with Republicans that may be fairly classic Republicans, notice that we have 26 values here that you may be able to connect with them on. We don't want to brush all Republicans with a broad brush and assume they're all the same, but these are some values that many Republicans do espouse. And the last principle here in the spirit of MI is evocation, which means that we're going to evoke our partner's wisdom about change. We're really using a Socratic approach here. And the idea is that people are best persuaded by their own reasons rather than by our reasons. And we'll show you how to do that with evoking change talk. So we're going to do a quick visit to the Hokey Pokey Clinic. And what I'd like you to do in this next exercise, we're going to do a breakout here in a second. And I want you to think about the person you've selected as your partner, the person you'd like to collaborate with. And with the help of your fellow team members, I'd like you to do the next things. We'll take 4 minutes on this one. It's going to be a very quick breakout, 4 minutes total, because we have a tight time schedule. We want to finish on time. But I'd like you to do 2 things in this breakout session. I'd like you to identify something you appreciate about this person, your partner, and I'd like you to identify 1 or 2 values that you think your partner would resonate with and with which you could frame carbon fee and dividend. So the 4 processes. These are really just the 4 stages that we use to think about interacting with a collaboration partner. The first one is engaging, and this is where we establish a working relationship with a person. Some of you already have that with your member of Congress. Others, you need to start there. We then need to move to clarify the agenda. This isn't just about talking and having a good time. We have a clear agenda at CCL and any collaboration. We also want to evoke, which means eliciting their reasons for change. We're going to give you some specific training in how to do that. And the final step is planning. And at CCL, this is what we call the ask. The ask, of course, is where we make our direct petition for their support at whatever level they can offer it. And MI is no different. We have that stage here too. Now I'd like to introduce you to the core skills for motivational interviewing. And the acronym for this is OARS. OARS stands for these 4 things. Our way of engaging with people in motivational interviewing is through open-ended questions, affirmations, reflective listening, and summaries. And many of you may have already had some exposure to this. So in your CCL training, this is quite parallel to CCL training, so I won't go into depth, but I will take a moment just to illustrate some of the key points. First of all, open questions. You may be aware that a closed question is one that there's a yes or no answer to. So that would be, will you support CFD legislation? That tends to shut the dialogue down. An open question of the same type would, how much do you know about our bill? So the 6 what, when, where, why, and how are very good segues into open dialogue, and we want to use those open questions wherever possible to draw our partner into a more active dialogue with us. Affirmations are where we spotlight their abilities, strengths, efforts, values, or intentions. And CCL, in some of the trainings I've been to, does a good job of this, I think. We know the importance of calling attention to what we appreciate in our partner's behaviors thus far. So just a note from MI, the research shows that using recognition, which is noting their behavior, is more effective than praise. And here's the difference. Praise. Praise is evaluative. So if I say to my member of Congress, Representative Bishop, boy, you did a great job of dealing with that oil-related issue in the tar sands in Utah. That's a very evaluative statement. Now, of course, he's likely to take that as positive. But the research actually shows, interestingly, that just noting the positive behavior can be more effective than passing judgment on it. Because even though it's a positive judgment, it's still a judgment. And for reasons we won't go into here, you may find it more helpful simply to recognize what they've done. So we notice that you voted this way on this bill. And we appreciate that, but notice that there's no praise offered in that approach. If you had to get good at just one skill tonight, this would be my favorite for you. Because in my work as a psychologist and as a lobbyist, reflective listening is probably the most powerful skill that I see. And this is where we simply paraphrase back our best understanding of their thoughts and feelings, both pro and con, and that's counterintuitive, I realize. And we're also going to talk about what they've expressed, they've stated, as well as what they've implied. So good reflection is both at the surface level, what they've said, and at a deeper level, what they've implied. And I'll try to give you some examples of this. And for this one, I'd like a volunteer. Do we have one of our people online tonight who would volunteer to do a little role play with me on reflective listening? Do we have a volunteer?
I'll volunteer.
Great. Hi, Linda. Thank you for volunteering. So, Linda, what I'd like to do is ask you, do you have any project of self-improvement underway right now? Are you trying to do something better in your life? I mean, all of us are either trying to lose weight or read more or get more exercise. Do you have any of those kinds of things going?
Yes, I would say that I am trying to plan in a more orderly fashion for my next phase of life. How's that? Is that too general? That
sounds great. So what you're saying is that you really care about what's coming up in the next phase of your life, and you're giving some thought to what you're going to do and how you're going to do it.
Right.
And it sounds like maybe this is driven by some specific values. What values are driving that urge to plan the next phase of your life?
I'm a planful person. It's a survival issue. It's an issue of let's see, how do we put this? Choosing between living with family or living in a community where I have years of connectivity and a sense of identity.
So there's kind of a little bit of ambivalence that you're experiencing here. On the one hand, you'd like to be with family, but on the other hand, staying with people that you've come to know and be close to is a bit of a dilemma in this process.
Exactly. If you can help me with that.
You've done a great job. So what I've done here is I've tried to reflect Linda's thoughts and feelings about this. Obviously, this is a very short sample. But I also, when you're dealing with reflective listening, it's very important to reflect both the pros and cons. And Linda here implied, or at least I detected it was implicit in what she was telling me, that she's a bit torn because she has two values that are at variance with one another. And as I see her now, she's nodding, which is a good sign to me that my reflection is on target. And we want to look for that very sort of a thing. A person's body language will let you know that your reflection is accurate. And it's okay if your reflection is inaccurate. They'll say, well, not exactly, it's more like this. And then whatever they say, you reflect that to make sure you have conveyed that you understand what they're saying. But you want to reflect both pros and cons and what is both stated and what is implied. So that's a very tiny sample of reflective listening. Any questions we have on that before we go forward?
Well, my question would be, so you have to be an active listener and really hear what people are saying. And some of us are better at that than others, right?
Absolutely. And motivational interviewing really gives us some tools to get good at this reflective or active listening. It's also called active listening, you're right. And it takes practice to get good at this. And what I'm going to encourage all of you to do tonight is to create a learning team. And you've been in one twice now with two other people. That's a learning team. Reflective listening and all of the skills I'm sharing with you tonight are going to be much easier to learn, and you'll learn much quicker if you get into a group of 2 or 3 other people. That is where you really get the feel for this. You can't practice this by reading a book. You can get the ideas, but it's going to be very hard to practice without other live human beings. And so Linda's willingness to join me here is invaluable to show these things, because you just can't do that with a book. So you're right, it does take practice. Well, I'm going to move on here for sake of time. We've got tons of things we could spend more time on, but we'll try to cover the bases here. The S in OARS stands for a summary, and a summary is like a bouquet. periodically, as we're interacting with our partner, we're going to summarize the problem as they see it, options that they like, and why. And we're also going to talk about any agreements and follow-up plans if we're actually to that stage. And the summary is the way to cement what has been said thus far so that it doesn't escape. It creates closure. It creates a package that allows this to be captured and maintained over time and refined and developed. So the summary is an important part of this. So I'm looking at the time right now, and this is a new technology we're working with a breakout room. So we're running just a little bit behind the schedule I had planned on. So what I'm going to do here is maybe just do a demonstration with a couple of you rather than do the breakout rooms. We'll just stay live as a group. And what we'd like to do here is I'll be the advocate, the lobbyist, and what I'm going to do here is get a partner. And so I need two volunteers. I need somebody who will be my partner, and my partner is a member of Congress. You can play any member of Congress you want. You can play your member of Congress, and my job will be to use OARS with them. And we also want the rest of you to be observers. And as you observe me interacting with my partner, I'd like all of you to take out a piece of paper and put the letters O, A, R, and S. And remember, OARS stands for open-ended questions, affirmations, reflective listening, and summaries. And every time you hear me make an open-ended question, affirmation, or so forth, put a little check mark next to that letter because I want you to get good at seeing OARS. And the first step is to just recognize it when you see it happening. It's a very big step that helps you get better at doing it yourself. If you can't recognize it, it's hard to do it. And so do I have somebody out there that would be willing to play a member of Congress? Could be local, could be or a national member of our Congress, either way. Anybody up for playing that role? And I'm going to go back to OARS just so everybody can see what we're doing here. There they are.
I'll do it.
And who is that?
Steve Gann.
Steve, thank you so much. Is there a particular member of Congress you'll be playing?
Yes.
Tell me who you are.
I am Congressman Dan Newhouse in the 4th District in Washington State. I'm a farmer.
And so you're a farmer by trade and you're a congressperson.
I have a lot of farmers in my district.
Very good, very good. I actually practiced psychology in the state of Washington in Pullman once upon a time. So I had lots of farmer clients. So Representative Newhouse, tell me just a little bit about how much do you know about our proposal for carbon fee and dividends?
I've heard about it, and I have to say it sounds pretty interesting.
I'm kind of curious to find out which parts of it you've found interesting.
I like that revenue neutral part of it because I don't like big government, so I like that revenue neutral part of it.
So that revenue neutrality is something that's pretty consistent with your values.
Yeah, and I also like the tariffs on imports because my farmers export a lot of their products, and they are very concerned about making their products more expensive and not competitive.
Wow, and I just have to say, as one of your constituents, I've actually been noticing your voting record, and I really appreciate the positive voting that you've made that has supported our state farmers here in Washington. They're an important part of our economy, and I noticed that you've been an active supporter of them.
Absolutely.
Anything else that you find interesting about carbon fee and dividend?
Well, I do care about climate change. I'm not a denier. I'm not sure what's driving it, but I want to protect the snowpack that farmers in my district are reliant upon. And so I'm wondering what we can do about that. I think there is a need to do something about that.
And it sounds like you see a connection between what's happening with the snowpack in the Cascade Mountains and the impact that's having on your farmers here in our state.
Absolutely. We're very much dependent upon that snowpack for our summer irrigation.
No, and at CCL, we really appreciate when our members of Congress are aware of the science and notice that connection between what science is telling us about climate change and the impacts it's having on agriculture and other parts of our economy. So to kind of summarize, it sounds like you are aware of some of the key features of carbon fee and dividend, excuse me, and it seems like you've seen a few aspects of it that intrigue you with regard to some of the issues that are of concern to your constituents.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, we'll step out of role here, and thank you to Steve for playing an educated member of Congress. It's always nice to run into one of those. So now let's go out to the group. For any one of you that was keeping a tally of OAs, Rs, and Ss, what did you see? How many of each did you see? Any brave person out there? Go ahead.
No, I counted 3 O's to start off.
Good.
Yep.
Any A's, R's, or S's?
Yeah, I counted 4 O's, 2 A's, 5 R's, and 1 S.
Okay. Now, what you're going to see when you do this in small groups, when you get into a learning team, is everybody's going to get a little different count because, of course, some things could be categorized subjectively a little bit one way or the other, but you guys are right on top of it. In your learning teams, when you start practicing MI and your other lobbying skills, in a learning team, it's really important to do these role plays that we're doing, these practice sessions where you practice your skills, and it's really nice to get objective feedback on your frequency of these key things that the research has shown builds the relationship more quickly. So you're right on, that's what you do. It's as simple as that, just keeping a tally of these specific types of communication that we know are important. So we'll keep that brief at this point. Any questions about OARS before we move on?
Hi,
Yes.
this is Abaya. May I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Thank you. I actually have been very hesitant to open with an open-ended question because to me it kind of puts them on the spot, and if they don't know about carbon fee and dividend, it highlights that, and I don't think anybody wants to appear uninformed or yeah, so that I have a hesitation about that. What would you say?
It's a good point. And I think you're absolutely right. We have to be careful. We don't want to put folks on the spot. And you're absolutely right. I took a chance that Steve was going to be an educated member of Congress with regard to carbon fee and dividend, and I got lucky he was. But normally I would know whether or not to open with that question based on that research we've talked about. I would want to research my member of Congress, and if I don't have evidence that they know about carbon fee and dividend from any of those sources we mentioned earlier, you're absolutely right. I'd want to start with a much less presumptuous question than that one was. That's a very good point. Appreciate that.
I have a question, Dave.
Yes, please do.
It seemed to me as I was keeping my tally, and I had 3 open-ended questions, that there was a little bit of an alternating between open-ended questions and any of the other 3. And I wondered if that was deliberate.
Yes, this is very flexible. These are tools that you can use in any order that seems to flow best for your style. So one member of your delegation that's lobbying with your member of Congress might be using mostly open-ended questions. Another person who's very good at affirmations may hit those a little more heavily. And another person may do the reflective listening, which in my experience is the most challenging because you have to be a really good listener. You want to catch both that overt as well as covert content. And it's a really good way to bond with somebody because they really feel heard, they really feel understood. But you're right, you can rotate those at any frequency you want, and some of your members in your delegation may be better prepared to do some of those than others.
Great, thanks.
Well, I'm going to move along here to our next section. So, the last skill set that I'd really like you to get some experience with here, and then we'll break into more questions and more practice, is this thing that we call change talk. And this is something that you may not have run into anywhere else. Reflective listening, open-ended questions. Most of you have found skills like that talked about in other venues, other places. But motivational interviewing has found that change talk is a crucial element to getting collaboration going. And what I'd like to do now is tell you about what this is and show you what it looks like, and hopefully, if we've got time, give you a chance to practice some change talk. And what we're doing here is we want to evoke our partner's reasons for change. This is really quite unique to MI. We, instead of us making the primary case for carbon fee and dividend, if we do our work right, we'll be able to connect with our partner's values in such a way that we lead them to make the case for voting for carbon fee and dividend, instead of us having to make most of that case. Blaise Pascal, famous French mathematician and scientist, once said that people are much better persuaded by their own reasons than by those that come from the mind of another. And motivational interviewing research shows this is really the case. If you can help a person, if you can evoke their reasons for moving in the desired direction, that tends to stick much better than reasons that you might have provided yourself. But that, of course, is a bit of an art, and we're going to show you how to do that. So change talk is represented by an acronym DARNCAT. We'll get to the elements of that acronym in our next slide. Change talk is talk that argues for change, and it comes in a number of different types. The research shows that the more you can get a person talking about these things, it predicts movement in the desired direction. Motivational interviewing was first developed with individuals who were substance abusers, and these are some of the toughest clients we deal with in my area, clinical psychology. Motivational interviewing in its early stages discovered that when counselors and psychologists induce and evoke change talk from the client, that they move much faster. They resolve the ambivalence, because anybody who's trying to abandon a substance abuse habit feels very torn. There's a part of them that wants to recover, but there's a part of them that is sees reasons for sticking with their existing pattern. So change talk is the way that we help resolve that ambivalence and get action moving in the desired direction. And a simple way to put this is that people have to talk the talk before they walk the walk. And this is a very specific kind of talk that leads to the walk. Here's DARNCAT. DARNCAT stands for desire, ability, reasons, need, commitment, activation, and taking steps. Let's spell this out now. You want to get the other person talking about their desires, their wants, as they relate to the change that we're promoting. We'd like to get them talking about any sense they have of their abilities and means to make this change. So for members of Congress, we have to put ourselves in their shoes and think about what abilities or resources would they need, and we want to ask questions about those. We want them to start thinking about those abilities that they already have to move in the desired direction. We want to ask questions that get them talking about their reasons for moving in this direction, as opposed to just presenting our reasons for the change. And we also want to get them talking about their need. And with our last member of Congress, who I role-played with just a moment ago, with Steve, he mentioned that he has a need to help the farmers in the state of Washington. He was engaging in change talk right there, and I definitely wanted to ask questions that would keep him talking about his needs that clearly line up with our proposal of carbon fee and dividend. So these first four are what we call preliminary change talk. This is from people who in those stages of change are still not terribly committed. They're mostly ambivalent still. Once you've got a person who has moved fairly far along in the stages of change, this is a person who now is getting very friendly to carbon fee and dividend, now you can use CAT, the last part of our acronym. Now it's appropriate to ask them about their commitment. And these are the things that they're willing to say that they're going to do to change. Now we're getting concrete verbal commitments from people, and we want to ask them what they're willing to commit. Activation is a fancy psychological term for willingness. We want to explore their willingness to go ahead and vote for this proposal. And finally, it's important that we get them talking about any steps they've already taken in the desired direction and any that they're currently taking that moves them in this direction. That's DARNCAT. And There's nothing fancy here, but the key is that we want to ask strategic questions about these areas. So when I'm working with a client or I'm in a member of Congress's office, it doesn't matter. And this is true when I'm dealing with my 16-year-old daughter as well. If I'm having a discussion and I have, I want to collaborate in a desired direction, I am thinking of DARNCAT. And I'm going to ask strategic questions in each of these areas. And you'll see that it reduces defensiveness and it gets people collaborating much more quickly. So let's give you some examples here. I mentioned earlier in our presentation tonight that one of my challenges is lobbying Rob Bishop. This is Congressman Bishop. He's over my district here, 1st District in the state of Utah. And as I mentioned, he is not known for his environmental friendly attitudes. So I'm going to tell you a little story about how DARNCAT saved my neck when I was lobbying with CCL, with Rob Bishop. So one day, it was our turn to go lobby Rob in his local district office. We, of course, lobby him when he's on Capitol Hill as well. And in his I had a delegation of my fellow CCL members. I had one person who is an atmospheric scientist on our group. I had another who is got a master's degree in biology. And I had a third person who has a doctoral degree in yet another related area. And there was myself, the 4 of us. Well, we started off and my partners began, and they were doing a pretty typical approach. They were giving the scientific evidence for why carbon fee and dividend is a viable option. They were talking about the economics of it. They were presenting a lot of compelling statistics. It's taking everything he's got not to just fall asleep and hit his forehead on the table in front of him. So he's flanked by 2 of his aides at this point, and we can tell the mood in the room is getting tense. And with motivational interviewing, you want to use your social intelligence. And social intelligence, or emotional intelligence as it's sometimes called, just means look at the obvious. Look at the facial expressions. Look at what's both being said as well as what's not being said. And of course, he was looking at his watch periodically and just kind of enduring this presentation, even though it was good information. So finally, we realized this is going absolutely nowhere, and it was time for DARNCAT. So instead of this, we switched. This was about us talking about our desires, but not about his desires. DARNCAT is not about us. DARNCAT is about our partner. And we were making a cardinal mistake from an MI standpoint. We were talking about our agenda instead of his. So we switched. And I asked a question of Rob. I said, Mr. Bishop, I would be interested to hear about your desires with regard to environmental issues here in northern Utah, which is where we're from. And I was amazed when I turned the tables and asked him about his environmental interests, which was really kind of a stab in the dark because I don't think he has many. He started talking about carbon sequestration. Now, is that carbon fee and dividend? No, it's not. But it's movement in the right direction. He's now talking about things that would be beneficial for removing carbon from the atmosphere. He then started talking about corridors for renewable power transmission. I didn't even know he had any interest in this. And we talked about how, yes, that's an important thing because as we start transferring our program with carbon fee and dividend, this will promote things like wind power generation from places like Wyoming. And he started sharing with us spontaneously that he'd had a recent meeting in Utah with President Obama in which they had talked about creating corridors for renewable power transmission. And we said, wow, with carbon fee and dividend, we're going to see a big influx in power in places like Wyoming from wind generation. That would be perfectly in line. We're going to have to get those corridors put in place to transmit the power from those areas. And he went on to talk about how economic growth and sustainability are 2 things that have to happen. All of a sudden, the mood in the room changed. And as you can see here, this is more of the facial expression and body language we were getting from Rob Bishop. This comes from simply asking about his desires. That's the D. That's just one letter in DARNCAT. You don't have to use DARNCAT. We simply use the D. And shifting that emphasis from our desires to his was enough to change the tenor of the entire meeting. And of course, you can ask questions about the others if need be. But sometimes a single question can turn the tide in a lobbying situation. Any questions up to this point about DARNCAP before we dive into the mechanics and practice a little? Maybe it's pretty straightforward. Let's do a little practice. So what I'd like to do is, since we're coming up on the last 15 minutes here, rather than DARNCAT takes a little bit more practice than some of the others. So what I'd like to do is demonstrate it for you like we did with OARS. And then if we have time, we'll do a breakout room where you'll take some time to maybe have a chance to practice it a little bit. But I'll demonstrate for you first. I'm wondering if I could get Steve, who's already helped me in the past, be a member of Congress. It would maybe be a little faster if we picked up with you, Steve. And if you could continue playing that member of Congress, would you be willing to do that?
Sure.
Great. Let's bring Steve back. Steve Gann, thank you so much. So let's imagine that, and I'm sorry, you're Representative Newhouse, as I recall.
Correct.
So Representative Newhouse, let's assume that we're picking up where we left off our lobbying conversation a few moments ago. And we've now established, I'm out of role for a moment here, Mr. Newhouse has already let me know that he's acquainted with carbon fee and dividend. I already know a few things about why he thinks it might have some importance to his constituents. And so now what I'm going to do is start asking some DARNCAT questions to see if I can get a little bit more change talk. And again, we're not expecting to get him to vote for this necessarily in this session, but we're trying to move him steadily in the direction of support for CF&D. So Representative Newhouse, I'm really pleased to hear about the kind of thinking you've been doing about the interaction between the environment and agriculture in our state, Washington State. So I'm kind of curious to know do you have any other reasons for being interested in a proposal like carbon fee and dividend? Is there anything else that strikes you that that might be a good reason for looking at that more carefully?
Not really, but I do have a concern, and that is that a lot of my farmers, they're not making a connection between carbon and climate change, and that makes me hesitant to do anything that is against that.
Right. So, boy, having been here in the state of Washington myself for a while and working with a number of farmers as my clients as a psychologist, I think I have some idea what you're talking about here. Environmental change, global climate change, global warming is not really a topic that many of your farmer constituents resonate with, if I understand you correctly.
Absolutely.
And so one of the obstacles, it sounds like, even though you see merits for carbon fee and dividend, would be, it seems like you would need a way to help your constituents see the merits of this, since it sounds like you can see that it would have some benefits for them.
I can see that, but they don't see it. And I don't know how to get them where they can support it.
Right, and this is something that we find in lobbying in various areas across the country, is that we realize that we need to do some education. This is not a simple issue. It takes a special approach to help people understand the importance of this. I'm wondering if you can think of any abilities or means that you might have that would, or that we might have to help you with, that would help perhaps shift the opinion of the public with regard to a proposal like carbon fee and dividend. Or have you, in your experience as a congressperson, seen ways that you can help constituents understand a more complex issue like this?
Yeah, I think that I need more voices out there, because I can say something, but I need some cover, because if I take a position, I could get primaried, frankly.
Absolutely, because you can't step out there and take a strong position if that's not going to be supported by your constituents. And so it sounds like you would be open to or interested in maybe having some help with that. I'm wondering if there were some ideas that Citizens Climate Lobby had we have, for example, an education division, and I'm wondering if it would be useful or interesting to you if the next time we met, if we brought some ideas that the larger national CCL organization has come up with for addressing this kind of a problem. Would you have interest if we were able to bring you some of those kinds of ideas, since they've obviously been encountered in other areas?
I would like to see what material you have. And I would also like help in getting the word out. And maybe some of your volunteers can help with that.
Yeah, what you're talking about here is an area that we actually give quite a bit of attention to. It's called environmental communication. There's even a whole discipline now that's dedicated to environmental communication. And it really aims to address the very need that you're talking about here, which is we realize that we have a need to educate the public in a way that's compatible with their desires and their values. And we could definitely bring some of that information the next time that we're scheduled to meet, which I think is in next quarter. I think we're scheduled to meet here that'd be in 3 months. Sounds like you'd be interested in that.
I would be, very much so.
Great, great. And it sounds like if you had the right kind of support, you'd be willing to seriously consider voting for carbon fee and dividend if the support were there.
I have to see indicators of it. I have to see evidence of it. But yeah.
That would be important. You'd have to see some clear and strong indication that the tide of opinion would be in support of that.
Yes. Great.
So I'm going to, first of all, thank you, Steve. I'm voting for you for the next congressperson for Washington State. I like your attitudes. So thanks for helping us out with that, Steve. So let's take a step back now for a minute and feel free to ask any questions you might have about DarnCat. What did you see? In fact, I should have asked you to just make a DarnCat list on the side of your paper and put tick marks indicating whenever you saw those. What did you notice? Where did you see me tapping into desire, ability, reasons, needs, or the other DarnCat elements? Did you catch any of those?
I did catch them all the way up through commitment when they said that they would actually do certain things to change. I don't think we got activation or taking steps.
Right. And I would say the same. I think that's a good observation. Notice that Steve, or in this case, Representative Newhouse, is pretty much in the early stages of change. He's not a pre-contemplator, but he's contemplating making change. So that's not at ground zero. And so I was able to connect with him on several of the DARN levels, but he's not far enough along that I'm going to really push the CAT part. That's a secondary, that's a higher level of change talk that I don't think he's quite to yet, which is fine. And did you notice that I was also trying to create a bridge so that we have a reason to come back next time and we have something he's requested us to bring? Notice that I am now stepping into a collaboration role with Mr. Newhouse here. That is my whole goal with motivational interviewing, is to pull up, instead of it being me versus the other person, which too often it is, I want to pull into alignment so it's me and that person collaborating towards a common goal. Did you feel that little bit of a shift when now he's saying that it would be great if I and my CCL contingent can bring him some information on this topic? That's what we're after. We're trying to move into that collaboration mode, and we started getting a good dose of that. Any other questions or observations on DarnCat? Sounds like we're good.
Question?
Yes.
I am assuming from this that you would say, no, this would not be a good time in this meeting, and maybe not even in a follow-up, to bring up the statistics from the Yale School of Communication on the percentages of support in his district, or quotes about how millennials and young Republicans support action? Because that might sound a little contradictory. Am I reading that right? Or would you bring that up? No.
You know, if I think you're onto something very good there, and that's a good example of taking something, a resource that you know about that pertains to Mr. Newhouse's questions and concerns. And what we usually do there is we ask permission, even though if I had that report at my disposal and I know those statistics and I know that it's pertinent, usually it's better if we ask permission before we give people information. We say, hey, guess what? I've got something that answers that question you have. I would probably phrase it this way. I would say, are you aware of the Yale report that actually looks at the percentage of constituents possibly in your own district here with regard to their interest in something of this sort? It's 99% chance that he's going to say yes to that based on what he's told me. And now it's him asking for it instead of me offering. But absolutely, that's a great resource to offer at a time like that. Any other questions or comments?
I can jump in.
Great.
I was fascinated by that, Dave. I definitely saw you working the desire end of it. And interestingly, when you asked about what obstacles does he see, that seemed to also connect to him enabling to talk more about what he wanted. And
yes.
And then the whole abilities part of it was where it got really collaborative, because he identified obstacles and partly I saw him articulating what needed to change, which was the constituents knowing more. But then you were able to jump in there collaboratively with some ways to help him do that or help that happen in his district. So that was really interesting to me, how quickly you managed to get it collaborative.
And something else, I'm glad you pointed that out, Madeline. Another thing that you may have noticed is that I was using OARS, and in my reflective listening, I was reflecting both the things that he was saying in favor of carbon fee and dividend, but I was trying to reflect just as much his concerns and objections and worries about it. Because if you don't do that, motivational interviewing has shown, if you don't acknowledge those concerns, they go underground and they will sabotage you every time. Even if you say, oh, we really don't think that should be a problem, you should vote for this out of principle, it's the right thing to do, that's the wrong direction to go. Anytime you get somebody who's voicing concerns, you want to reflect those, you want to validate those, and then do what you can to help them address those obstacles, even if you believe that they're maybe not that important. Again, it's what they think, it's their desires, their concerns that we find move us much faster into collaboration. That's a good point. Well, I'm noticing that we're coming down to our last few minutes here, so I'm going to hit our last few slides and then leave some time open at the very end for final questions and observations. So, of course, the last phase of motivational interviewing, as it is in lobbying, is planning, and this is where we make the ask. This is a great time in motivational interviewing. We want to bridge to action, and these are some ways that you can do that. You can ask questions like, would you be willing to do this? If you feel the timing is right for that, how can we follow up? I did that with Congressman Newhouse. I strategically wanted a good reason to follow up with him and bring him something useful. These are some of the kinds of questions that we're using to see if we can set the stage for ongoing collaboration, which is our central goal here. So we've now covered the 4 skill sets of MI. It's been a whirlwind. You have been, many people, their first full training with MI is often a 6-hour training. So you've done in 90 minutes what we sometimes do in 4 to 6 hours. But you've had a taste, which was our goal tonight, to kind of see what MI is about. And there's a lot more to it than I've shown you here tonight, a lot of really cool techniques. And so I should point out that if you're interested in learning more about motivational interviewing, the book, Motivational Interviewing, is the best way to get a good summary of the program in its entirety. And that book is by Miller, Moyers, and Rolnick. And that book is available. The MINT website, M-I-N-T, is the Motivational Interviewing Network of Trainers. They have a great website that can give you more resources. I'll put in a plug here. My wife and I, this is myself and my wife, Charla Hart. She's an instructional designer and educator, and the two of us are going to be doing an MI workshop, a 2-hour block at the National Conference in June. And we would be delighted to have any of you join us there. We'll be covering much of the same material, but we'll have a little longer format, so more opportunity for practice. And probably my biggest pitch to you is to get into learning teams. If you find this interesting and useful for your lobbying, I would invite you to each find 1 or 2 other partners. You can do this in person, but if you have a small group and you can't find partners locally, you can do this by Skype. And you can also do it by phone call to practice OARS, DARNCAT, and these basic skills. And the research shows that practicing it live is by far the quickest way to develop the skills, like we've done here tonight, both modeling and doing role plays. So anyway, those are some ways to carry on from where we've been. Those are the basic skills that we've covered tonight. I'll put those on screen so that if you have specific questions about some part, it'll be easier to remember it and ask the specific question. Let's take a few final moments here for final comments and questions.
One question from Stephen, not the Stephen that you were speaking to, but another one was, what about when you aren't face-to-face with someone in real time? So I would imagine, I guess maybe they're talking about possibly communicating through email or something like that.
It's a great question. When I am communicating with somebody by email, I definitely use my motivational interviewing skills. So how do you do that in a written format versus a verbal format? Well, if you look at OARS, you can be asking open-ended questions in an email that you're sending to someone. And of course, writing slows this whole process down, which is maybe a little cumbersome, but frankly, it's also an advantage because when you write an email to a congressperson or someone else you're collaborating with, you can use OARS, DARNCAT, you can consult the Spirit of MI, the 4 processes. All of these can guide you in structuring these communications so that they're likely to have maximal impact and help really cultivate the collaborative relationship that we're after here. So much of this, it often requires that motivational interviewing has really highlighted with hard data that we often progress faster by going slower. And what I mean by that is rather than just jumping to our ask and pushing people to sign on to our proposal, if we're willing to take a little more time and invest in really cultivating this deep collaborative relationship where we show deep understanding with OARS, and we're really drawing the person into change talk, it's their rationale for making the changes we're looking at. In the long run, we progress much faster towards our final goal. I'll give you an example of some of this kind of research. There's a great deal of motivational interviewing research now with regard to physicians using this with their patients. Because a physician is, let's suppose that I'm a doctor and I have a patient with severe diabetes. And that patient, if they're going to recover, has got to follow a dietary regimen, an exercise regimen, and a medication regimen of insulin. If I simply go in and I say, gee, I've got 13.5 minutes on average to interact with my patients today, it's very tempting for me to just go in and spend all 13.5 minutes lecturing my patient on what they need to do. The research shows that if I do that, I get a very small change in behavior. But if I take time and I use motivational interviewing principles and develop that relationship, I may have only spent 4 or 5 minutes talking about what the patient has to do, but now the compliance rate goes up tremendously. And I've still used the same 13.5 minutes. I've simply allocated my time in a much more strategic way towards building the relationship rather than simply being a debater and offering all of the rational argumentation for why the regimen I'm proposing is the right one to go with. So physicians now are realizing their big complaint about motivational interviewing is they say it's too cumbersome, takes too much time. We've got too little time to spend on this. And the research shows they're dead wrong. You don't have the time not to use motivational interviewing. If your goal is to get people well and change behavior, get them collaborating with you, motivational interviewing is a huge saver of time, and it is definitely your friend.
Yeah, we certainly have about the same amount of time when we're visiting our members of Congress, so it's an apt comparison. I love it. Louise asks, how can you, or should you, I guess, maybe also use this when giving presentations?
It's a great question. Don't do it the way I did it tonight. And what I mean by that is a webinar, of course, just the format doesn't lend itself to the back and forth dialogue that I really enjoy. And motivational interviewing is about dialogue. And of course, tonight we have constraints where it's a webinar and that limits our time, and our technology limits how much back and forth dialogue we can have. But if you're going to do presenting to an audience of people, I really encourage you to shift. And I've learned a lot about this from my wife, who is an instructional designer, is really up on that body of research. In her field of education, they call that being the sage on the stage. It is what almost all presenters do. They stand up and then they pontificate about all the good stuff they know and expect you to go away and use it. The research shows that is a very ineffective way of changing behaviors. But if you switch from being sage on the stage to interactive mode, where you create a dialogue with your audience and you encourage the audience to start thinking deeply about questions, and you start asking open-ended questions, and now it's a dialogue between you on the stage and the audience. You're going to see us doing this at Washington, D.C. at the national conference. That's where, because it's not about what's in your head, it's about what's in your audience's head. And you want to get them engaged and telling you what are their concerns, what are their thoughts, what are their values. Because if you can't connect what you're saying to those items in their head, most of what you say will have washed away before they even leave the conference. We've all had that experience. We hear a great, inspiring speaker, and we think this is great stuff, and a week later we can barely remember the key points. But the educational research shows if you're engaged with the presenter, and in these ways that Darncat would suggest we do, you're going to have a much bigger transformative experience. So we're certainly going to be trying to do that and model some of that at the national conference this year.
Great, thanks. Thanks for the question, Louise. George and then Jean raised their hand. So Jean, we'll be coming to you in just a second. But George asked in the chat, how would this be different when talking with congressional aides instead of the member of Congress?
Oh boy. In some cases, I actually prefer speaking to the aides than I do the congressperson themselves. And many of you may have noticed this. I won't name names, but we have some Congress people here in Utah that are really very senior, and it's starting to show up in their cognitive faculties. And this isn't always the case, but often the staffers are much younger and they're much better informed on climate issues. In fact, generally staffers are much younger than the Congress people that they're working for. And in my experience, they are more savvy. They're more environmentally inclined as a group, even if they're conservative. And if you can use these techniques to engage them, it's really no different. You want to use the same approach, get deeply engaged with them, and help them feel that collaborative spirit, because when you've left, they have the boss's ear. And if you've made this impression right, you actually, I believe, can have a bigger impact working with staffers, because they can interact with that congressperson all year round, long after you've gone. You may have 15, 20, 30 minutes at best, but they have the congressperson's ear at all times. So in many respects, I think you want to do just the same thing and engage those staff people, because they can be tremendous allies in getting to the Congress people.
Thanks for the question, George. So Jean has raised her hand, Jean Brunson. So Jean, you're unmuted now. So go ahead and tell us where you're joining from and ask your question, please.
Hi, I'm from Long Island in New York. And my question is, it seems like this would be incredibly valuable if you're talking to someone who is ambivalent about making a change. I'm wondering if you would also use this with someone who doesn't yet see any need for making a change.
Absolutely. In fact, MI was originally designed for the people who have no interest in change. Bill Miller, the developer, started doing research with this at a large substance abuse treatment center in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, one of the biggest ones in the country. And they were dealing with really hardcore substance abusing addicts of various types. And these were people that were often court referred. They did not want to be there. They had no interest in giving up their substance abuse habits. Motivational interviewing was born in an environment where change was needed with people who had no interest in making that change. And so when I do longer presentations, frequently I do a 4-hour or a 6-hour longer training. we go specifically in how to adapt this to those people that are in that pre-contemplation phase. That's the research name we use for that. These are people who are not even contemplating making a change of the sort we want. And you do have to adapt it a bit to those people. So for the darn cat skills, you're going to stick strictly with the DARN. There's no cat to work with at that stage. So it's actually counterproductive to ask them the cat questions, because those are intended for people who are further along in the change process. So yes, we do adapt it specifically to those people, and in a longer training format. Hopefully at the national conference, I'll be able to give you some concrete examples of how we adapt it to those pre-contemplators, as we call them.